Nice. That's great. Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, I think this is our crowd here. I'm Anthony Odell. I'm a resident science here in the Natural Resources Center. I do have monitoring, and I was fortunate enough to meet Mickey Cassar. He is a field engineer with the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, and he's been doing some really cool work this last summer, and he's going to tell you all about it. And the name of the talk is "What are earthquakes? How do we monitor them? And how do we receive forewarning?"
Yeah, it was a lengthy one.
Yeah, it is a lengthy.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yeah, like Anthony said, my name is Mickey Cassar, field engineer at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington. You guys probably potentially have seen me around. So if you've ever seen what looked like Derek's truck driving around, but it was 10 times dirtier, that was me. We have pretty much the identical vehicle. So, probably not Derek if it's really dirty. So today we're going to talk about three major things. We're going to talk about the PNSN. So what is the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network? We're going to talk about earthquakes. I'm going to give some basic background kind of information. I'm not one who likes to assume that everybody knows everything about earthquakes. I think it's better to just kind of give some foundational information. And then we're going to talk about kind of resources and regional earthquakes and resilience, why it matters, why we do what we do, that sort of thing. So who we are, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. We are a regional seismic network as part of the associated or the Advanced National Seismic System. So the ANSS is a kind of collaborative group headed by the U.S. Geological Survey. They essentially determine who is in charge of monitoring earthquakes across the United States and the world, whose kind of information on any given earthquake is what should be considered most kind of primary, because a regional seismic network is a seismic network where, you host seismic equipment in a region and you have kind of the most accurate and up-to-date information for any earthquake that occurs in that region. And so the ANSS is able to direct both funding and resources and essentially authority over those regions. So we are tasked with monitoring earthquakes and volcanoes in Washington and Oregon states. We're a collaborative between USGS, UW, UO, and the Cascades Volcano Observatory. And we're comprised of scientists, engineers, students, and educators. So, we have anybody from IT staff to field engineers like myself. We have student employees that we employ all year round. So Anthony and Derek's our student employees, undergraduate students that come out and get paid pennies on the dollar to do most of the work for us. It works out pretty great. So yeah, that's kind of who we are. What do we do? So we currently have over 650 seismic stations across the states of Washington and Oregon. We use those to generate seismic data. We then operate servers and software. So the servers collect the seismic data. The software processes the seismic data. We collaborate on developing software. We also develop our own software. All of it works together to then generate things like earthquake early warning, generates things like shake maps. I don't know if some people are familiar with shake maps, but essentially shows shaking intensity after an earthquake occurs on a kind of a regional map that's impacted by that event. We do volcano monitoring, and then we disseminate information on any sort of earthquake that occurs. We have people that work around the clock 24/7. So if there's a magnitude 3 earthquake or higher, we are required to respond to that earthquake within 30 minutes. We take any information we have gathered, we process it, and then we send it along to Washington EMD. We send it along to any federal stakeholders in the region. So it just kind of depends who's around. We work with BPA. We work with kind of a number of partners and different agencies across Washington and Oregon. And let me just point out that this map over here, so each of these triangles represents a seismic station across Washington and Oregon. So each of these is one seismic station in different locations across the state. And you can see that they are largely clustered in kind of we have two main ways that we cluster seismic stations. We cluster them around sources, so places where we expect earthquakes to occur. The coast is of utmost importance. We also cluster them in places where there's high population density. Having that shake map information, having stations kind of at a high density in an area where there's a lot of people is really useful in the event of an earthquake, so that then we can determine where resources can be allocated. Not us, but partners and stakeholders can then determine where resources should be allocated after an event. So we're going to talk mostly on the field side of things when I'm talking about our operations. So my work as kind of a field monkey is mostly in the field realm. And so I'm going to end up talking a bit more about that. If you want to know more about our servers, our software, any of that kind of stuff, I can refer you to somebody, but I personally have only kind of limited ability to really get deep down in the weeds on that. And honestly, I think this stuff's more pretty and it's more interesting. So I'm gonna present it for those reasons too. So this is a seismic station up at Snow Dome, up on Mount Olympus. We have kind of solar equipment, communications equipment up there. We've been operating a station up there for some decades now. So we have two major flavors of seismic stations. We have broadband seismic stations and we have strong motion seismic stations. This is a couple of photos of broadband seismic stations. These stations are stations we utilize a really sensitive instrument at broadband seismic stations. It can pick up really broad ranges of frequencies. So we tend to locate these in places where there's a lot less cultural noise. So we don't put them in places where we expect a lot of vehicle traffic. We put them out in fields and in rural regions. They're really useful for research, and they have components that make them really useful for large shaking too. But we like to put them out in quiet places because then they're even more useful for research purposes. We then also have strong motion stations. So this is an image of one such strong motion seismic station here on the peninsula. That box on the left-hand side houses all of our electronic equipment. So on the right side is a picture of what it looks like inside of that box. On the lid there, we have all of our kind of power system. Down on the floor, we have two backup batteries. And then that green, little instrument there, that's the actual strong motion seismometer. So these strong motion seismometers, as opposed to the broadband sensors, do not operate with an actual mass on a spring. They actually just operate with a voltage applied to a mass that is actually determined not to move. The voltage is applied such that the mass inside of that sensor won't move, which makes it really effective for a large earthquake. Whereas those first sensors or those first stations, they actually have masses on springs, and those masses in a really large shaking stop being useful at a certain amplitude range. So then we're going to talk about the three things that are needed to run a successful seismic station. We have power, so that's the first component. Everything requires some power to run. We utilize two major kind of power sources. We have solar power stations. So this is one of our solar designs, a solar swing set station. That aluminum box on the ground there is kind of like that last aluminum box that you saw. It's all of our equipment, backup batteries, all of that. And then solar panels on a solar array. The seismometer is in the ground off screen here. So it's similar to those first pictures. Is a broadband station where you have a pipe that goes down into the ground, and a seismometer sits down some 5 to 10 feet, depending how deep that station was able to get down to. This is an AC powered site, so we'll utilize either AC power or some other line power at different places. So if we have AC power available, we'll utilize it. It's just a lot more reliable in certain ways, and especially when we utilize backup batteries. Because out here on the peninsula, we'll lose AC power, so we utilize the backup batteries. But the problem with solar, sometimes solar just cannot be reliable. It's really reliable in the summer up here, and in the winter, you can have a hard time kind of keeping it up. So we have to monitor those a lot more closely. Our AC stations, it's really powers off or powers on, and it's not a huge deal. The second component for seismic stations is communications equipment. we utilize kind of three major sources for communications. Essentially, the idea is if you looked back at that map, we have an array of seismic stations all over the place. And all of that information needs to come back to UW for us to process the data and then turn it into something useful. So we need to utilize high or low latency communications to get our information from everywhere in the state back to UW quickly. Three ways that we do that. One, on the left-hand side, we have different schools, fire stations, hospitals, all sorts of resources where there are actual internet connections, and we prefer fiber connections where we can get them. We'll just plug right into a server rack. We'll work with IT staff to negotiate access to the internet, get data back to UW, just going straight through that pipe. The middle here is a radio site. So we have a lot of point-to-point and point-to-multipoint radio networks. This is one here. You can see Lake Ozette in the background there. So this is one up here on the peninsula. It's kind of down that Hoko-Ozette Road up in the mountains there. That actually transmits data from a number of seismic stations across the region. And so we utilize these major telemetry hubs to get data from really remote locations, oftentimes back to one of these server racks where we can then get it up onto low latency internet connection. And then the third kind of major communications transfer mode that we use is cellular networks. So we'll go into cellular networks where it makes sense. Cell is everywhere, especially with the advance of FirstNet cellular communications. If you don't know about that, that's first responder prioritized data accesses run by AT&T, but funded by the federal government. That allows for a more secure pipe for communications over a cell network, so that if there is a high traffic event on the regular cellular network, it won't knock out important communications. So we utilize those all over the state too. What we really like to do is we like to take all of those different communications modes, and we like to make it a really diverse array of each of those in every region. We don't want to rely on one type in one region, because if you have a cell network outage and everything's knocked out in that region, you're not going to be able to locate earthquakes in that region at that time. And the thing about major earthquakes is they knock out infrastructure. So you don't want to stay on the same kind. And then the last component of a seismic station is instrumentation. So here are a couple of photos. The one on the left-hand side is a seismic vault. So that's one of our different types of seismic vaults where we put seismometers at the bottom of that vault. We try to get seismometers down because that reduces the impact of cultural noise. And by cultural noise, I mean cars, people running around, whatever, just people, airplanes, all of it can be detected by our seismometers. And the deeper you go, the less impact that has. So we'll put a seismometer on the bottom of that. And then that orange thing in that picture on the left-hand side, that's right in front of Brendan's face. That is called a data logger. That takes the seismic data, it packetizes it. So it puts it into little packets that can be sent over the internet. And it takes information from a GPS antenna that we keep on site and puts GPS time onto the seismic data and then makes it so that we can send it over a communications network. The right-hand side, that is one of our seismometers. That's one of those broadband seismometers with a mass on a spring. It looks like a heavy soda can. They're pretty easy to use. We have a newer design, or kind of newer seismic networks over the last 7 or so years started, rather than installing those large HDPE vaults on the left hand there, we started putting 8-inch PVC vaults down in the ground, and we put those sorts of sensors on the right hand side down there, and it's a lot easier to work with. You get a lot less flooding when you can just glue a bunch of Schedule 40 PVC together than when you're cutting huge holes through, you know, one of those drainage pipes. So, Chip?
But those packetizers, do they buffer the data and for how long?
Yeah, so Chip just asked whether the data loggers buffer the data and for how long. So they buffer for as long, they do buffer the data, and they'll buffer it for as long as your card can hold it. So we started putting 256 gigabyte cards in these. So one seismic station will generate about 5 megabits or megabytes per day. So, you know, a gigabyte is 1,000 megabytes and you've got 250. So it's a long time that we can store those. What's really useful about that is if you ever get something that interrupts and for some reason your telemetry doesn't send that data along from the buffer, it's still on the card in the sensor or in the data logger. So you can still go back and pick it up, which is what we're doing on the airport right now. We don't have it currently communicating. We're just buffering the data on site and picking up the cards. So they have big cards, so we don't have to go often, but we want the data soon. So that's kind of how it works. That was a great question, though. So seismometers, just to show kind of what some of the principle in a seismometer is, or what some of those principles are. So essentially a seismometer, this is a home-built one that one of the seismologists put together it's been around for decades, this seismometer at the lab. And there is essentially a magnet that is mounted to this pivot. There is a coil of copper here. And as the magnet passes over that coil of copper, it generates an electrical signal that then goes into here, and it causes that needle to swing in either direction. So what essentially happens with a seismometer is as the seismometer is bolted to the ground, so this wood plate would be bolted to the ground, as the ground shakes, the pivot stays, what's the word? It stays in one place. And so as the ground shakes, the rest of the equipment actually moves around it and it stays in one position, and it generates a signal that goes in a positive and negative direction according to where it is based off of where that mass and that spring are. So if we watch this little video, so you can see, if it won't so loud, you can see that there's 0 in the middle there, and as it passes to one side, it goes to the left and the other side. So that then generates a record that you can translate into a seismic graph. So if we go, here's another one that actually shows kind of the whole process on a drum. So this is the old way that we used to do it. We actually used to use a piece of paper, a heat transfer piece of paper, and it would generate a signal essentially in that same way. So draw on that paper what the seismic waves actually look like. Here's another one with a vertical seismograph. So this is with a mass on a spring, like I was talking about with those broadband sensors. So now to kind of get deeper into the weeds on what we're doing and, you know, what kind of the foundation of what we're doing is, we'll talk about earthquakes and what they are and how they're generated. So to do that, we kind of have to come back to, you know, what is the earth? So everybody's heard about the layered earth. That's a complicated creature. So it has many layers to it. There are two general ways that we distinguish the layers of earth. Kind of on the left-hand side here is focusing on a compositional way of determining what Earth's layers are. So in a compositional definition of Earth's layers, you have the center here, that's the gray, that's the core. That has one composition, iron and nickel. You have this orange layer here, that's the mantle. And then the exterior layer out here, which is basically just the black line, is the crust. So that's one way you've heard of the layers of the earth: core, mantle, crust. Now there's another way to define the layering of earth, and that is a rheological definition. Rheology is essentially what is the state of a material. So liquid, solid, plastic, elastic, you know, you kind of have, that's what rheology is. So this on the right-hand side is more based off of the rheology of the materials within Earth. And the two that we're really going to talk about in this presentation, mostly about earthquakes and mostly relevant to earthquakes, are the asthenosphere and the lithosphere. So the lithosphere is this upper two brown layers, which contains the crust and the uppermost mantle. So the lithosphere and the asthenosphere. The lithosphere is a brittle layer. It's an elastic layer. So it's hard like a rock is hard, like any rock you pick up. So it breaks, right? If you have a rod made of rock and you bend it, it breaks. Now the asthenosphere is a plastic layer. And to picture what a plastic would be like is Play-Doh. So Play-Doh is essentially a plastic material. If you push on Play-Doh, it stays deformed. You poke into Play-Doh, you get a little hole, and that hole doesn't bounce back. But if you poke into a bouncy ball, an elastic material, that bounces back. A tennis ball, when you poke a tennis ball, it goes back to its original shape. So that's an elastic material. Now, crust is brittle and elastic, and the asthenosphere is plastic, and it's deformable. And the crust sits on top of that asthenosphere. Now, what happens is you, on the very top, that brittle crustal layer ends up being broken up into a bunch of different pieces called tectonic plates. So you may have heard of plate tectonics before. Those tectonic plates are these large, brittle plates on Earth's surface that sit on top of that plastic asthenosphere. And plate tectonics always kind of confused me until probably even just 10 years ago, when I was already well into my professional career. Out of college, I had always kind of just waved my hands about it and didn't really understand it in a way that made a lot of sense to me. But one thing that really helped me to conceptualize tectonic plates was, so if everybody could join in and essentially hold out one hand and pretend that you have a tennis ball on that hand. And that tennis ball represents the Earth. And then in your other hand, you take a potato chip and you place that potato chip on the surface of your tennis ball. Now, if you have a potato chip resting on your tennis ball, does it wrap around the Earth? No, it just sits flat. So I want you to take your other hand and make that potato chip wrap around the tennis ball. Well, what ends up happening to that potato chip? Breaks into a bunch of different pieces. So that's a really easy way to conceptualize what the tectonic plates are. Those tectonic plates are just broken up, brittle pieces of potato chip on the tennis ball that is Earth. And all of those broken up pieces of potato chip are sitting on top of that plastic mantle layer. And that plastic mantle layer is really hot. And it being really hot, it is always moving. So you guys have heard of convection before. I'm sure everybody's heard of convection, but maybe doesn't fully know what it is. So an easy way to picture convection is if you take a lava lamp, and if you've got a lava lamp, what happens is there's a waxy material inside of a liquid material. And at the bottom of your lava lamp, there is a hot lamp down at the bottom, right? And that waxy material, as it comes down to that hot lamp at the bottom, it'll sink down. It hits that hot lamp or gets down close to it. That lamp heats up the waxy material, which causes it to expand. And as it expands, it becomes less dense than the liquid, and it starts to float up to the top of the liquid. Well, as it gets to the top, it gets cold because there's only a lamp in the bottom. So it starts to condense and become more dense than the liquid, and it starts to sink because density causes things to sink and be buoyant comparative to one another based off of their densities, right? And so Earth's mantle, Earth's upper mantle, the asthenosphere, is very similar to that lava lamp, except that you don't have these pockets of wax that are floating in a liquid. It's that whole material is just getting hot. Earth's core is really, really hot. It's still retaining a bunch of the heat from when Earth itself was formed. And that heat stays down inside of there, and out on Earth's surface, it's really cold, comparatively speaking. So what happens is that asthenosphere, when it's closer to the core, when it's deeper down, it gets hot and it starts to rise because its density becomes lower. And as it does that, it goes up to the surface, and then it starts to cool down as its density increases. And it keeps doing that. There's this engine under there. Well, this brittle crustal layer sits on top of that asthenosphere, So as you've got that mantle convection occurring, it essentially helps to drive the motion of those tectonic plates. So those tectonic plates, those brittle plates of potato chip, are always moving relative to one another. And it's driven in part by this mantle convection process. It's also driven in part by other processes, but that's kind of the best way to conceptualize at least one of the major driving factors in it. So when we talk about that convection and we're talking about earthquakes in Washington State, we talk about Cascadia. So in Cascadia, we have an oceanic plate just offshore called the Juan de Fuca plate. And then we have the continental plate that we sit on called the North American plate. And so this is just kind of showing more of that driving. This is the essential scenario here, where you've got that convection driving the slab to subduct. So the oceanic plate is subducting underneath the North American continental plate. And that convection is driving it, but also the weight of that oceanic plate, once it starts that sinking process, the weight of it starts to pull it down too. And then you also have where that's generated offshore, it's really, it's hot and it's high and it's much higher than the rest of the material. So it also pushes the slab. So there's kind of this trifecta of different factors that drive that engine. Now, if we look at this image, it helps to just kind of give a representation of what the Cascadia subduction zone looks like. So Juan de Fuca plate here, Pacific plate out here. This is where spreading ridge is. So you have kind of magma generated. There's new oceanic seafloor that's created at that spot. This Juan de Fuca plate is being pushed and pulled down relative to the North American plate. And that's partially because oceanic plate is much denser than continental plate. So that dense oceanic plate subducts underneath the continental plate. Now, the thing about this margin here is that it's not hot, it's really cold. You've got water that cooled down all of this oceanic plate. Continental plate is not extremely hot in most places. So that margin between that black line in between the Juan de Fuca plate and the North American plate, that's not a mushy, flowy place. Things are stuck. It's really cold. And what happens is as that plate starts to move, or as they move up against one another, things don't just move easily. Things get stuck. It's really kind of dynamic, and it's really sticky and cold. So here's a good way to kind of represent what it looks like over time. So you have the oceanic plate subducting underneath the continental plate. All of it's sitting on top of the asthenosphere. And what happens is as that oceanic plate starts to move relative to the continental plate, it becomes locked. And as it becomes locked, you get this kind of deformation. It's almost like a pencil. When you start to bend a pencil, you can kind of start to see the pencil bend. And that pencil just keeps bending and it keeps bending and it keeps bending. And eventually it gets to a point where the pencil can't bend anymore and you end up getting an earthquake. So essentially, a way that I like to conceptualize this, and you'll get to see this right now. I always want to try to get the timing perfect with that, Lita. So essentially you get this earthquake, and what happens is that crust bounces back up a little bit because it's an elastic material. And so it bounces back up and it displaces a bunch of water. So that's where you get the resultant tsunami too. So the earth breaking, where you've got a bunch of these stresses imparted on the earth, that is what the earthquake is. The earthquake is not the shaking that you experience in an earthquake. It's actually the earth breaking itself. And then the shaking is resultant of that. So a way that I like to conceptualize it is if we're all in this room and I have a pencil and I'm bending it, and you guys all close your eyes, you don't have to, just think about it this way. You guys have your eyes closed and you know I'm bending a pencil. Now, eventually I'm bending it. What's going to happen to it? It's going to break. Yeah, it's going to snap. And if your eyes are closed, how do you know that the pencil broke? You could hear it. Well, it's essentially the same process, right? It's the same kind of general idea with an earthquake. The Earth is always moving. It's constantly moving underneath our feet. It's dynamic. And it's storing up a bunch of that energy inside of itself. And as an elastic material, it stores it up just like the pencil does until it can't hold any further. And then when it can't hold any further, it breaks. When the pencil breaks in the air, it sends sound waves to your ears. When the Earth breaks underground, there's no air, right? It sends seismic waves all the way across the Earth. And a large earthquake, you can feel an earth, or you can detect an earthquake on the other side of the planet, right? Even relatively small earthquakes, a magnitude 5 earthquake can be detected across the planet. Our sensors here in Washington picked up North Korean nuclear tests. So it's, that's how sensitive our equipment is. So generally, that's what an earthquake is. And when there is an earthquake, those earthquakes generate different types of seismic waves. And so a really good way to illustrate that, you have kind of 2 major categories of seismic waves. You have body waves. Body waves are these ones, the black lines that travel through the Earth. And then you have surface waves, those yellow waves that you saw moving a lot more slowly. And with body waves, you have 2 types of waves as well, P waves and S waves, compressive waves and shear waves. And those travel at different accelerations too. So if you look at where these seismic stations are, seismic station A, they're houses, but consider them like a seismic station B, C, and D, you can see that the seismic waves arrive at different times based off of their acceleration, based off of how fast they move through the Earth. So one thing that's really cool in demonstrating the 2 types of body waves is using a slinky. And does anybody want to help me with the slinky demonstration? Because it's a little big. Yeah, great, thank you.
Well, usually I put it on the floor, but we have this really nice table here. We don't have to. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate what a P wave looks like. So that's a compressive wave. Now, a P wave, do you want to do it? So that is a compressive wave, P wave. So if I put my wrist just like that. So you can see that P wave travels, and if you pass it back and forth. So that P wave travels, right? It's a compressive energy through the Earth. Now, S wave is the other type of body wave that we have. So that's a shear wave. So a shear wave. Now, when we look at the P wave to the S wave, so do you want to do the P wave and then pass it to me, and then I'll do a shear wave back to you? So P wave. Now, when we look at the 2 types of waves, this wave looks like it travels faster. In this demonstration, this one looks like it has a higher acceleration, which is faster. You can make any guess, and the wrong answers are fine. Shear. So shear wave, actually, I think it's more just the way that I put my wave, but actually the fastest I can do is the P wave. That's a good wave. It's much faster than the shear wave. So you have a faster P wave, and then which of the 2 waves generates more shaking? So would it be the P wave, or would it be the S wave? So now what we can do is thank you very much for that. So when we operate seismic networks, we use that kind of pair of differences to generate earthquake early warnings. So whenever there's an earthquake, you get a P wave, and a P wave travels faster, but it also causes less shaking. It causes little to no damage generally. An S wave travels much slower, and so that blue line is the S wave in this, and the red one's the P wave. The S wave travels much slower, and it causes more damage. And then you get those yellow ones, the surface waves, which travel even slower and cause the most damage. Those, we essentially set up a system that measures earthquakes using our
seismic equipment that is extremely sensitive. Our seismic equipment is able to pick up those P waves that most people don't even register. And then we're able to actually generate a location for an event before S waves arrive at a given location. And we can say, hey, there's an earthquake coming, and you have X number of seconds before major shaking can arrive at your door. Science, that's right. Oh, seconds, yeah, seconds, yeah. Well, so it's really dependent on how far you are from the event too. So when we talk about the major Cascadia earthquake, which occurs offshore here, Forks gets significantly less warning time than, say, the Seattle region, which is unfortunate. And it's just part of the realities of earthquake early warning. We can't predict earthquakes, but we can at least put a system in place that helps us reduce some of the impact one way or another. And what's really useful, even with a seconds of warning, is when you incorporate earthquake early warning into regional systems or systems on an emergency scale, right? So you're talking about emergency response scales. So ShakeAlert is able to be integrated with power systems, with fire department doors, so that a ShakeAlert earthquake early warning is generated, and a fire department has a few seconds for an automated process to open the doors so that you can actually get things out of the bay without the bay doors being broken by an earthquake. And then when you talk about major metropolitan centers, you can actually have things like the BART in the Bay Area or the Link in Seattle, or any number of train systems slowed down automatically so that you don't have train derailments. So there's a lot of ways that the seconds are not always the most helpful in an individual scenario. And yet on a regional and, when you're talking about the resources that are going to go into responding to impacts, if you keep a region-wide transit system from breaking down, you are significantly impacting the whole region as a result of not having to put resources into fixing that too. So then that allows it to cascade, the benefits cascade downstream. But yeah, seconds. It's just part and parcel with the situation. So regional earthquakes. Wow, I'm at 50 minutes. Oh, we started at 39, I think. So that's good. Regional earthquakes. So now I want to talk about earthquakes in our area, the earthquakes that can be generated. So in Washington, Western Washington, Cascadia region, we have 3 major earthquakes that can be generated, types of earthquakes. We have the first ones are deep slab earthquakes. So if anybody experienced the Nisqually earthquake in 2001, that's a deep slab earthquake. We get those most frequently. So those ones happen really frequently. It's 85% chance in a 50-year period. So, we had one in 2001, there was one in 65, there was one in 49. So, they happen very frequently. Thankfully, they happen really deep. So by the definition of what causes them, they are a deep earthquake. So a magnitude 6.8 Nisqually was 30 some odd 60. It was about 60 kilometers deep. That 6.8 magnitude is the same magnitude as the Northridge 1994 earthquake in California, except Northridge was less than 15 kilometers deep. Northridge earthquake knocked down highways and caused hundreds of deaths, whereas Nisqually, 1 person died, and they died of a heart attack. So, it's thankfully our most common earthquake is the one that tends to cause, at least less of the damage than the other earthquakes. Next, we have Cascadia subduction earthquakes. So these are the ones everybody talks about, the mega thrust earthquake. These earthquakes happen anywhere from every 300 to 800 years. There's a giant earthquake magnitude 8+ every about 300 to 600 years. So there was the last time there was one of those earthquakes was in 1700. So it was just over 300 years ago. That was a magnitude 9 earthquake. One of the saving graces for it, we can talk a bit more about that detail when I get to those slides, actually. And then the last type of earthquakes that we'll have in this region are shallow crustal faults. So we're talking about faults like the Seattle Fault, the North Olympic Fault Zone, which is in kind of the Lake Crescent region, the Tacoma Fault, South Whidbey Island Fault. Those earthquakes happen in the hundreds to thousands. It's really dependent on the fault system for those earthquakes. So we'll talk about now the North Olympic Fault Zone. This one last experienced a major earthquake about 1,000 years ago. I was talking to Derek about it a little earlier. He asked a question about it. There have been 4 to 5 earthquakes in the last 11,000 years. So there tend to be what we call a recurrence interval. So that's how often we expect a major earthquake in a fault zone, recurrence interval. A recurrence interval in the thousands of years. It's not extremely well constrained. Crustal faults, especially in a wet region like here, are really hard to trace. The recurrence intervals are hard to pin down because it's just so wet. Things move a lot. Things get eroded away. Things get overgrown. It's just a lot harder to keep track. But we have a solid record of 4 to 5 earthquakes over the last 11,000 years. Last one being 1,000 years ago. This can generate 7 to 7.5 magnitude earthquakes. That's a major earthquake. And that depth that we were just talking about, the depth is much more like a Northridge depth than it is a Nisqually depth. So magnitude 6.8 Nisqually was that impactful. Well, imagine a 7.75 at that depth. Now, the thing is that recurrence interval is a little bit better. It's something to look at and say, okay, at least we don't have to panic about that existence, but it is something that we should always be aware of because it's definitely, the impact of it can be rather important to kind of track. Because this fault zone, as you can see, it's kind of this rectangled area. You have these dark red lines. So it crosses Highway 101, it crosses Highway 112. So it has impact if it were to slip. But the recurrence interval at least is a little less worrying. Then we have the Cascadia subduction zone. So what we're talking about now is Olympic Peninsula regional earthquake sources. So that one was North Olympic Fault Zone. And then now the Cascadia subduction zone, this is the big one. The last major earthquake was 324 years ago. We actually have a time and a day that the event occurred because there are Japanese records that were actually able to pinpoint the timing of a tsunami that you could backtrack all the way to the generation of that tsunami on the day of that earthquake here. So it's a combination of Japanese records and rock records that allowed us to determine the exact time and day of that event. So 324 years ago is a magnitude 9. Now, if you see in these two lines, I split it into a magnitude 9 recurrence. So that's that recurrence interval, and a magnitude 8 recurrence. So magnitude 9 happens recurrence interval is about every 500 to 800 years. So we're outside of a magnitude 9 recurrence interval, typically. Magnitude 8s happen every 300 to 600 years. So we're within a recurrence for a magnitude 8 event, because the last major earthquake was more than 300 years ago. So there could be a magnitude 8 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone. This map on the right-hand side is an illustration. It's called a shake map. I mentioned them earlier. This is a shake map for a magnitude 9 scenario. So this is just generated based off of what we know about the region, what we know about where the fault zone is. And then this is a color scheme, and you can, I wish the focus were a little better for this. A color scheme and the kind of damage scoring or kind of damage intensity scale for that color scheme. And I actually pegged out magnitude 8.1, so a modified Mercalli intensity scale. That's what the scale there is on the right, of 8.1 at Forks. So I zoomed in and clicked the pin on Forks and then zoomed out to take the screenshot for this. So in a magnitude 9 event, you would get an 8.1 intensity. And if I can read it, so it says damage slight in specially designed structures considerable damage in ordinary substantial buildings, that means large buildings, which would experience partial collapse, damage great in poorly built structures, fall of chimneys, factory stacks, columns, monuments, walls, and heavy furniture overturned. So the MMI scale is basically a designation of how much shaking you would expect and how much impact to human structures. That's what the basis of that scale is. So for Forks, you would experience an 8.1 in a magnitude 9 event. Now, talking about a magnitude 8 earthquake, which is where we're within the recurrence interval for, that's a factor of 30 less energy release. So essentially a magnitude 9 earthquake is 30 times the intensity of a magnitude 8 earthquake. So that's just a way to kind of give a general sense of the lessened impact of a magnitude 8 earthquake versus a magnitude 9. I would have tried to get a magnitude 8 shake map for this because I think it would have been most helpful for the discussion, but I couldn't find one and I didn't have time to figure out how to get a hold of one either. So, but it's, the main points of this is these earthquakes can happen here. There's a good likelihood that a major earthquake will happen in this region within any number of years. And we certainly need to be prepared for a major earthquake to happen in this region. And, this region is already relatively remote when there's practically expected power outages. It takes 6 hours, as you guys were talking about, just to get a power outage that you knew was coming. So magnitude 8, magnitude 9 earthquake is going to definitely impact the region really significantly. So preparing as much as individuals can, and then on top of it, making sure that our regional infrastructure is prepared to account for the things we expect to fail. Because we know certain things are going to fail in a major earthquake here. So we need to prep for them. So one of the things that we are trying to contribute to, we as the PNSN we can't fix roads. We can't even tell people to fix roads or how to fix roads or where to fix roads or et cetera, right? But what we can do is we can try to impact things by sharing the resources we have, by trying to teach people about the things that do exist so that then maybe the regions can respond effectively and accordingly. So one of these systems is ShakeAlert. All of ShakeAlert in this region is founded off of our data. So all of our stuff, our communications infrastructure, power infrastructure, all of it goes into any ShakeAlert earthquake early warning generation in this region. ShakeAlert, as we were talking about pretty deeply earlier, is, it's that early warning. It's not a prediction of an event, but it can tell you within seconds or minutes, can give you a heads up ahead of it, and then you can integrate it into major systems, but also people can receive alerts too. And if you get a phone alert that says you're going to experience heavy shaking in 10 seconds, well, at least you don't have that moment where it hits and then you go, oh no, this is an earthquake. You can at least have that moment of recognition occur before it even starts shaking so that your brain can start going, maybe I should, and then it hits and you're underneath the table because you had some extra time, right? All of it is about, definitely on the individual scale, is about just making more successes possible, making more people impacted positively. So there are 3 ways for individuals to receive alerts via your phones. So you get WEA alerts, so make sure you turn those on. That's a simple way to get an earthquake early warning alert. If you have an Android phone, you get an alert automatically. You don't have to do anything. It's coming to your phone no matter what. And then if you have an Apple phone, then you should download the MyShake app. It's free. It's developed by Berkeley, and it is entirely encrypted. So any of your personal information is not what they care about. And it's developed by Berkeley. It's not shared with corporations trying to steal your data or government agencies trying to take any information or try to build more information off of it. The main point is that, it's a phone app that can give you an earthquake early warning alert to your phone. And it tells you, hey, there's an earthquake, expect this amount of shaking, get under a table. So ShakeAlert, real quickly, ShakeAlert build out. So this is what the seismic network looked like in Northwest Washington in 2015. The ShakeAlert system was approved around 2015, 2016. So they started approving money to go into seismic stations so that we could build out the network. ShakeAlert is successful when you have really dense stations, because the closer your stations are to each other, the more quickly you can generate an alert from an event. So you surround an earthquake with seismic stations, you get them really close, those P waves get picked up right away. So then the system says, oh, there was an earthquake over here, and it can generate the alert that much faster. So 2015, and then in 2022, this is what the network looked like. So 2015, 2022, 2023. So significant build out in those 8 years. This is pretty close to complete with all of the major ShakeAlert funding. So that's why it ends at December 2023. We are currently working on some projects in the region to try to help further impact ShakeAlert. We have a project going on at the Quillia Airport where we're using that to try to impact offshore alerting, because the main foundation of locating an earthquake is surrounding it. And so if we can find ways to make a better and more accurate earthquake location offshore without having to surround to put instruments in the water, we're working to get that kind of solution figured out. So we're building an array out on the airport. It's already there, but hopefully that it proves successful. So after ShakeAlert, then talk about just general resources. Make sure you prepare. We say 2 weeks of water, 2 weeks of food, 1 gallon per person per day when you talk about water. So 2 weeks, 1 person, 1 gallon per day, 2 weeks, 14 gallons. Out here, especially if you have the room for it, I'd probably store more just to be even more cautious and thoughtful about it. If you have systems like the fire district and you guys have interest in that, we have people who know how to get you in contact with people to integrate systems to open bay doors automatically.
I looked into that years ago, but it was pretty expensive.
Yeah.
It's a subscription.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, so there's kind of options. If you have the overhead to develop it yourself, it's free, but you have to have the overhead to do it. You have to have the IT infrastructure or you have to buy the equipment to then at least do it. But there are ways to at least get connected. What I would say, so Gabe is just a UW employee, the person on there. He is not a person who's interested in pitching anybody on anything. But even if you just have base questions of how much has it cost other fire departments who did it, or can you get me in contact with the chief somewhere, he has all that info. So I would recommend at least reaching out, and he can at least give some of that kind of useful information. Because there are ways to do it for quote free. Non-subscription is what I mean. It's not, you still got to buy servers or, have IT person to at least keep an eye on it. But. Derek?
Question about the doors. Can't any fire truck plow right through a door if they had to?
Yeah, I guess you could.
I mean, that's the least point that damaging the door, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Bigger than we thought, some of the amplifiers.
You still get out though.
Like this.
I know, at Prince P's, when we were, part of one of those shakeouts,
Mm-hmm.
we realized that, we were one of the places that people might go to afterwards, but that I might not be able to get there. I was the counselor at the time. And so we worked with the fire department to make sure that they could get in and set up an emergency team, whether I was there or not.
Oh, nice.
And given that I live within half a block and a half of the hospital, I might be required to go there first.
Mm.
And so that meant that no one would have to depend on particular person at this team to be able to open it up and set up an additional emergency if they needed more.
Yeah.
Than what they already had full front on, full flow. And that kind of thing helps too, because it reduces the, and then Well, they've got the system, like, they've got keys and they're all.
Yeah.
set up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, I would say that Clallam County compared to many other places I've worked around seems to be at least a bit more aware regionally. I don't just mean the county itself, but I would say this county generally, different portions of this county, and have really put a lot of thought into that sort of resilience. And I think it's because of some of these unique things that we talked about too, is how remote it is and how, you can put a pin in the fact that we're gonna lose power. And yet nobody, the federal infrastructure is not gonna fix it. So it's on us to just do it kind of thing. I think there's a lot of that determination that happens here that tends to be pretty impressive. So, but yeah, having those structures in place ahead of time is always the most important thing. And so in the event of an earthquake, kind of the most important thing you can do is prepare ahead of time. Preparation ahead of an earthquake, because they will happen, you're way better off than if you don't. So a lot of these resources, there's the ShakeOut resource, as you were talking about with ShakeOut. ShakeOut helps to connect people who sign up for ShakeOut. It's once a year, happens in October. This year it was October 17th at 10:17 a.m. It's essentially an earthquake drill. It's a reminder to restock your water and your food, etc. Agencies and groups and even individuals can sign up for it, and they have a lot of resources of how to prepare too. Washington EMD has some really useful resources. They have the Prepare in a Year guide. So it's essentially things you can do once a month, every month for a year, so that by the end of that year, you're fully prepared. And that way you don't have to do it all at one point. That way you don't have to spend some thousands of dollars on a pre-made earthquake kit. You can kind of get that stuff done piecemeal. So there's really useful ways to kind of do all of that. And then when we talk about PNSN resources, so if we're talking about just user level resources, things that if you're interested about earthquakes, did an earthquake happen? Can I look at seismic data from a seismic station because I want to know about it? We have these links here. So we have our recent earthquakes page, shows earthquakes that have happened. We do that up to 2 weeks. You can search all the way back to the beginning of our records. We have the seismograms map that I can show, and then Quick Shake, which is a live stream of seismic data for any seismic stations we have in the system. That stuff is mostly out of interest, right? Our website also has resources to preparation information too. But I always like to show this stuff because it's the stuff that's, it's kind of eye-catching, really interesting, fun stuff. So that I want to show those because that's just the end. And I figure that might be a second. Let's see if I can get this. So here's a live stream of seismic data from a few stations. You can go to that configure button up here and you can delete stations, and then you can zoom into your region of interest. And you can say, oh, I'd like information from, one of our, actually, here's one at the hospital. I just want to see data from that station at the hospital. And that's live seismic data from the hospital here in town. So, it's just kind of a fun resource, interesting resource. It is only, you can see it's not every station in the region. If there's a station that you have on your property and you want to get that up there, we can get it configured, but it takes a lot of overhead to get them configured. So we only do it per request, and mostly at schools. Usually if we have a station at a school, we pop it up there because, the teachers like to display it. So, but yeah, that's just an interesting thing we like to do. So let me go back to this, but that pretty much takes me to the end. The main thing to do, if you experience an earthquake, ground starts shaking, don't get in the doorway. Don't lean up against a wall necessarily. If you have a table near you, get underneath that table. So you take cover under it and you hold on to the table. That's the most important thing you can do in an earthquake. If you've got a table that's near you or some sort of surface, That's kind of the best thing you can do. Doorway is really not impactful. Don't do the doorway thing. It's not useful. It's something that we've been told forever, but yeah, pretty not super helpful. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So there's quite a few of us who work out in the woods. What would you recommend doing if you're not inside of the building? Like, let's say that you're in the middle of the woods, you have the option to go stand in the clear cut, or, you know, what would be the best option for you in that situation?
Yeah, I think for me, you know, trees, I'm not super worried about trees broadly. But what I would, you know, if I'm in the middle of the woods, and you always tend to have situational awareness, right? Like you're always kind of keeping an eye out for widowmakers. At least I typically do. If I'm walking through dense stuff, I'm at least trying to keep a sense. If you know that it's shaking is coming because you got an alert, or if you start feeling shaking, that's the first thing I would at least check for, bare minimum, right? I would drop and I'd try to take some cover, and then I'd make sure there wasn't something that's definitely going to fall on me. If you're right next to a clear cut and it's easy enough for you to get over to it, might as well. It's not going to hurt, as long as the main thing you don't want to do, if the ground is shaking really intensely, is you don't want to run. Because if you run when the ground's shaking hard, you're way more likely to hurt yourself. You know, you could crawl. You don't mind getting your knees wet, dirty. Do that. I'd be much more inclined to do something like that. If I am in a building where I know, like if I'm in here, ground starts shaking, I'm gonna go under the table and I'm not gonna leave until the ground stops shaking. If I get an alert and I know that, oh man, Derek hasn't checked some of these lights in a long time, and it looks a little like broken down, and the alert says you've got 30 seconds, I might go out into the yard, into the parking lot. So that's kind of it's all about getting a sense of where you are, how much you trust the structure you're in, and how much time you have. So if you have an EEW, a warning, and you know you have time to get somewhere that you feel more safe, do that. Otherwise, keep an eye on what's around you and act according to that. Derek.
So this quality earthquake is in the kitchen. And the kitchen has the dining room has the same lights as these. They're all hung by cables. And I started hearing a noise, and all these lights were doing this big oval. And I didn't understand what was going on. I thought maybe the doors got left open, the wind was coming in. So I walked outside, and the whole staff was up at flagpole, which that's where they're supposed to be in an earthquake. And I go, "What are you guys doing?" I still didn't get it. I saw it right in front of me, and I didn't understand what was happening.
Yeah.
Really weird.
Yeah. Nisqually was cool because it was so widely felt, right? And what's interesting is regions where you're on sediment, like out here, and you're on a thick sedimentary basin, you're going to feel that shaking a lot further away, right? But you're so far away that at least the damage wasn't strong. But what was nice about Nisqually in a bunch of ways is that it was a really good regional reminder of earthquakes. And it caused some financial damage, but it really didn't cause any loss of life, you know, other than that one heart attack. So.
I know my boss, he was sitting in his office, he said his chair rolled back. So within a minute.
That makes sense, yeah.
I missed it because I was on the East Coast, but when our family moved to Longview, I know a few years later, I was taking geology, and the geology teacher was also a coach, and the earthquake happening, he instructed all the girls on the track, you know, supposed to baseball, to lie down on the ground, because the ground was rolling off.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So that was all sudden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's definitely a really important thing to do, is you don't need to run around. If you're in the middle of a field too, just get down. The most likely way you're going to hurt yourself is by falling. So
I'm not sure that you could.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good point too, yeah.
That drop part is kind of built in.
Yeah, to an extent, absolutely. There's a really cool video from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake at magnitude 9.1. There was a seismology conference in a school building, and they were recording a presentation. And somebody, I think, even had like, I don't remember if they had a phone camera, or I think they might have had a camera on a pedestal. Like, you know, like when you would take a camcorder and put it on a tripod at the back of a presentation because Zoom didn't exist. And they got an alert. So they all looked at their alert because they've had earthquake early warning for decades now. And somebody grabbed the camera and they all just filed out the door and went out the building because they had enough time, enough warning time. And you get this video of them all walking peacefully, calmly out, and then the ground shaking. Kind of whole. It's a really interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Network, like Vancouver Island.
Oh, hold on just a sec. Neil, I'll let you ask a question next, and then, sorry, can you repeat?
Is there a seismic network on Vancouver Island, or is it rely on our?
They do. So Canada has NRCan, so Natural Resources Canada runs a seismic network across the whole kind of country, and they have a base of operations in the Vancouver region, and they have stations up and down the island. And they are actually collaborating with us for this seismic array experiment. So what I was talking about with the airport here, we essentially put 10 seismic stations in a tight 100 to 300 meter spacing. And they've done the same thing up Vancouver Island in 2 additional places. And we're trying to see if we can utilize the combination of those arrays to even better constrain offshore locations of earthquakes. So, but yeah, that's the long answer to your short question. Neil, do you want to ask now?
Yes, sir. So it's a 2-part question. I have a piece of property up on the inside passage up in Canada, and also I live up the Snohomish Valley up towards Gold Bar and Index. With tsunamis, how far on going up the interior passage are you expecting it to go around Vancouver Island and also up the various river valleys off the Puget Sound? Or would we have, like, obviously it depends on how big an earthquake, but let's say in this one year, the 8 magnitude, how far up these valleys are you expecting a tsunami surge to come,
So the Gold Bar Index area, you wouldn't have to worry about tsunami at all.
30 or 40 feet.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. 30 or 40 feet of height, right? Wave height max. And so when you're talking about where you're going to see tsunami, it's going to be places on the coast, essentially. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the
Mouth of the Snoqualmie, is that or Snohomish? I mean.
From Puget Sound, I think that the effect would be less.
Mhm.
Coast.
Yeah.
That tsunami's got to come around the corner and down Edmonton.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's going to be some damping.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, even talking about in the Everett area, there are places where you will expect higher wave fronts, and there are places where you won't.
Everett would be, since it's kind of the mouth of the streets.
Mhm.
Space.
Yeah, but definitely not way up. And the one of the really important, or one of the really interesting things when you're talking about inside passage is that one of the places with the highest tsunami impact is actually East Sound, Washington in Orcas, which is way up that long sound in the middle of Orcas. And there's a lot of attenuation within there. And so what ends up happening is the depth of the bay and the direction of the bay, and it essentially is going to cause tsunami to be channeled up that and actually increase the height of the column at that location.
The water shallow. And the wave increase.
Yeah, right. So there are places, so it kind of would depend where you are in the inside passage, but what I would say, first kind of pass at a question would be, what do you think the elevation of is your property at that location? if you could guess?
I'm waterfront. I'm up by Texada Island. I'm actually up in the Jarvis Inlet. But
Mm.
I'm worried. My father was a geotechnical engineer and a geologist, and I did soil sampling. But so I built back than most people. I'm probably up 50, 60 feet, but some of the people are up 6 to 8 feet, off the shore. So that
Yeah. I think my main takeaway, especially if you're on coastline and especially if you're under, 15 feet, is definitely go inland or and really more than inland, go up. Up is really your kind of mainstay. So if you've got people who are only 8 feet up, even if you're well in, and I can't say that I know the inside passage well, so I'm not certain where this is. But what I would say is, if I know there is a major earthquake on pretty much any of the tsunami generating faults in the region, so you've got the Cascadia is a tsunami generating fault. You have the Seattle fault generate tsunamis. The Tacoma fault can generate tsunami. And there's actually a chance that the South Whidbey Island fault can generate tsunami too. So, you have a number of tsunami generating faults in the region. And my takeaway tends to be, if I know there's a major earthquake in the region and I'm on the coast, the first thing I'm going to do is take cover while it's shaking. And then once it stops shaking, I'm going to get uphill as kind of orderly and safely and quickly as possible too. But what I want to point to, and I don't know, I doubt that DNR does anything for Canada, though I'm sure that NR can. So that I should actually just Google that. Which is the Natural Resources Canada. They are likely to have some information on tsunamis. Now, I don't know how deep their information goes, but that would be my first pass. So if you can see on the screen, I just searched NRCan tsunami. And so I would look through their kind of information that they have. But then if you're talking about Washington, the Washington State DNR has an extremely, extremely extensive tsunami modeling project that they've been working on. So they've fully kind of developed a bunch of Cascadia scenarios, and then they're currently working inundation zones, right?
Can't believe it.
Yeah, it would be surprising if they didn't. Yeah, I agree. So for anything in Washington, you can point to Washington DNR. And then as far as Canada, I would definitely do some searching just to see if they have some similar models.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that was helpful enough. Let's see. Anybody have any other questions? I actually am going to pull it up. One of these.
There's nothing else on Zoom right now.
Okay. Sure.
So I've been talking with our emergency people about is there really
Is that the only bridge?
Only bridge.
Wow. Yeah.
Overhead structure bridges. Very well.
well, once that forward bridge is probably the best bridge in the area. I would say it hasn't been replaced.
Yeah, figure that all that steel, that superstructure underneath it has been exposed to pretty harsh environment for 80, 90 years. I doubt that it's got sort of maintenance to go to the bridge. It's hard to believe that it's great condition.
Yeah, I think.
Also, just think about just support the ends. Back when it was built, I doubt that they had any sort of earthquake thoughts in mind.
Right.
They didn't even know that there were anything
Yeah.
about them.
Yeah, Cascadia is of the last 50 years. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that, I don't have a great answer for that one. I mean, yeah, it would be get towards Quinault, but then you've got the, with the 101, you're not in good shape, but there's that DNR road that goes further inland by the correction center. That would be a better shape probably than 101.
There's some pretty suspect ridges.
Yeah. And the question too is, because I think one of the important things to keep in mind is whether or not, and whether the county, Jefferson, both Jefferson and Clallam have been coordinating with the logging companies, because there are a lot of places where there are routes through logging lands that could get to places where, you've got one, there are ways to get to Nia Bay using logging lands rather than exactly. Yes, and that's exactly the tricky part, is getting through the gates. And now that Rainier sold too, it's, it's gonna take time probably to change out keys and keys that used to work. Mm, mm,
That would.
Taller,
yeah,
remote as they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's bad enough with the roads are changing.
Yeah. I think the main point is definitely that this is something worth talking, worth making sure there are discussions going on within the county, and then within Jefferson County, and then within the city, and then within surrounding cities and the tribes and the logging companies. I know that some logging companies are at least a little bit easier to collaborate on these sorts of discussions too. And so, you would hope that there are government representatives having these kinds of discussions. But I can't speak towards that, right?
I was at a training in this room, and John Preston at the time was the ranger at the whole river visitor center.
Mhm.
And the penny dropped, and he said, "This happens in summertime. I've got a small town that I'm in charge of."
Yeah, 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 it's an interesting concern for sure.
I have one more question, if I could ask it.
Absolutely.
Liquefaction, is this a problem with Glacier Till and along the coast where Highway 101 is and the various beaches in this area? Or is there enough bedrock underneath to stabilize it from happening?
Oh, I wouldn't rule out liquefaction being a severe risk in certain places. Liquefaction's absolutely something to consider. Though I can't say that I have, like, I don't have liquefaction models on hand right now. But it's basically something in this region where things are so wet and you have so much soft material, because I mean, much of this region is glacial sediment. And so, you've got wet, sandy sediment in certain places that, it's definitely of a risk. But I can't tell you, yeah, I know these places are likely to experience liquefaction. It's something that needs to be considered.
So you haven't done modeling on it then?
Personally, no, but that's because I'm kind of a wrench monkey at a wiggle monitoring laboratory. So it's a little out of my personal purview. And I do know that there are liquefaction studies. Washington DNR, the Washington Geological Survey, has a lot of really useful resources. I don't know how deep their liquefaction resources go. But they have, this meeting is being recorded, it keeps getting in my way, there we go. They have this, what is it called? LiDAR portal geology. They have a geology, there it is, the Geologic Information Portal, run by Washington DNR, is a really kind of extensive and useful resource for all things geology. It would be the first place I would go to see if they have liquefaction. Yeah. Scenarios. Yeah, they have a lot of resources that are really helpful. I do know that there are liquefaction modeling groups within the US Geological Survey. Oh, yeah. Looks like DNR. Oh, here we go. Look at that. The PNSN might have some links that go for it. Dogami, DNR. Does this just take us to where we just were? Yes. I mean, for me, this is a Google foo, if that term makes sense, but. Yeah, I know there are groups who do liquefaction modeling. And the question is where to find the information. DNR is usually, in our state, DNR is usually a really good resource for any of this sort of stuff. But I do not know where to find it without spending a bunch of time Googling right now. So I might assign you with the Google task.
Fair enough. I'm just curious. It comes up in various places because of foundations and what have you. And I just was curious if it was something along the coast with your highway design
Yeah.
or bridge design. If it was, because it seemed like it was glacier till and fairly sandy materials.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's of much concern in our region. And I imagine somebody has some pretty good resources for it. And maybe we found one of them, but just by chance. Here we go, Grays Harbor County. All it took, yeah, there we go, look at that. So this looks like a whole report that DNR published some time ago. And they actually have some kind of liquefaction models that they've published in that report. So what I just did is I went to Washington's DNR page and I just searched liquefaction in their search bar, and that actually helped find something. So yeah, DNR is the Washington Geological Survey is an extremely useful resource. They are one of the I've lived in many states and I've done this work in many states, and it is one of the better resources and more kind of easy to navigate resources for this sort of information than a lot of other states I've lived in. So highly recommend it. Any other questions? I'm not leaving. I just saw 5%, so I was going to charge if any more questions came up. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for coming. And anybody on Zoom, if anybody wants links to slides, anything like that, reach out to either me or Courtney. Did you put my email? Yeah, Courtney CC'd me in the email. So you can send me an email and I can send you slides. If you're here, I have cards, so you can take a card if you want to. But yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you. And the presentation will be uploaded onto our website and on YouTube tomorrow, so you can access it as well as any other prior evening talks on the ONRC website.
Great. Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I work for the Limbo Tribe.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just south. We're doing a little bit of work with USGS.
Oh, nice.
Here, more sediment study related to glacial retreat formations and any of the earthquakes that we have been looking